Alan had a large collection of American stamps and Carl had a large collection of Canadian stamps. Originally, Carl's collection of Canadian stamps was two-thirds as large as Alan's collection of American stamps. Alan and Carl exchanged an unequal number of stamps. That is, Alan gave Carl M American stamps and Carl gave Alan N Canadian stamps. And M is not equal to N. After this exchange of stamps, Carl's collection of American and Canadian stamps was three-fourths as large as Alan's collection of American and Canadian stamps. If after the exchange two-fifths of Carl's stamps were Canadian and the rest were American, what part of Alan's stamps were American after the exchange? Assume the boys had no other stamps besides the American and Canadian stamps. Let's go ahead and analyze the question a little bit. What's going on here is Alan has a large number of American stamps and Carl has a large number of Canadian stamps. Alan gave Carl some American stamps and Carl gave Alan a different number of Canadian stamps. And we know originally Carl's collection of Canadian stamps was two-thirds as large as Alan's collection of American stamps, and after the unequal exchange, Carl's collection of American and Canadian stamps was only three-fourths as large as Alan's collection of American and Canadian stamps. That is, originally, Alan had only American stamps and Carl had only Canadian stamps. But after the exchange, Carl ended up having both American and Canadian stamps, and Alan also ended up having both American and Canadian stamps. We also know one more thing, and that is, if after the exchange two-fifths of Carl's stamps were Canadian and the rest were American, and we need to find what part of Alan's stamps were American after the exchange. So that's the problem. Give the problem a shot. Make sure you read the question a couple of times and genuinely understand the question. The good thing is you don't need much beyond 8th grade math to solve this problem. So give this problem a shot. My solution follows. What I have here is a brief sketch of the scenario and the question, of course. As you can see, originally I'm going to find out how many stamps Alan had and how many stamps Carl had. Either I'll find out or I will assign a number. And then AE stands for after exchange. After exchange, I need to know how many stamps Alan had, how many stamps Carl had, and then after exchange, Alan had both American and Canadian stamps. The A stands for American, C for Canadian, and the same thing is true for Carl. After exchange, Carl had Canadian stamps and American stamps. So once we can fill out this table, we are in pretty good shape. So let's see how we can work on the table. Originally, Carl's collection was two-thirds as large. What does that really mean? That means, I'm going to see if I can do it here. That means if Alan had 3 parts, then Carl only had 2 parts. Now, this is an important concept and you want to make sure you get it. If this represents Alan's stamps, this represents Carl's stamps. Now I don't know if one dot represents 5 stamps, 10 stamps, 500 stamps. But I do know one thing, that if you put all the stamps of both boys together, the total number of stamps is divisible by 5, or you can divide them into 5 equal groups. 2 of the groups will be Canadian stamps belonging to Carl, and 3 of the groups will be American stamps belonging to Alan. So I know the total collection has to be divisible by 5. 2 by 3 is also a ratio, and I'm getting this if Alan's stamps can be divided into 3 equal parts, then Carl's stamps can also be divided into 2 equal parts, and the equal parts of Alan's stamps and the equal parts of Carl's stamps are exactly the same. Okay, so having said that, let's change the color and say something very similar about the after exchange scenario. What happens after the exchange? After the exchange, Carl gets some American stamps and Alan gets some Canadian stamps. And Alan already had some American stamps and Carl already had some Canadian stamps. However, we know one thing. After the exchange, Carl's collection was only 3/4 as large. So if Alan's collection was 4, if you could divide Alan's collection into 4 equal parts, Carl's collection could be divided into, 3 equal parts. That's what we mean by 3/4. So this is Alan's collection after the exchange. This is Carl's collection after the exchange, and that tells me the total number of stamps between the two boys hasn't changed. So that tells me that the collection of stamps that the two boys have together is also divisible by 7. 4 plus 3 is 7. So I know a couple of things. The total number of stamps that the two boys have together is divisible by 5, and it's also divisible by 7. So I'm going to assume that the two boys together have 35 stamps. Now, of course, I don't know for sure if it's 35 or not, but since in fractions we cancel things, it doesn't, for all practical purposes, in the context of this problem, it really doesn't matter. It could be 3,500. It could be the total collection of the sum of the stamps of the two boys could be 3,500. Could be 35 times 2 or 70. Could be 35 times 3, 105. But for all practical purposes, it doesn't matter. I'm going to assume when you add the total number of stamps of the two boys before or after exchange, it is 35. And where is 5 coming from? 5 is 2 plus 3. And where is 7 coming from? 7 is 3 plus 4. And this is an important concept, important idea. So it's a good idea to pause the video and make sure you genuinely understand what's being said here. Let's write down somewhere over here that we're going to assume that the two boys had 35 stamps. Suppose the two boys together had 35 stamps. And you do have to understand the total number of stamps between the two boys didn't change. Some of the stamps just changed hands. Alan gave Carl some American stamps and Carl gave Alan some Canadian stamps. So we're going to assume if the boys together had 35 stamps, let's work on the first statement, which is originally Carl's collection of stamps was 2/3 as large as Alan's collection of stamps. What does that mean? Out of 35 stamps, Alan had 3 parts and Carl had 2 parts. And these parts are all equal. So I'm going to take 35 divided by 2 plus 3, which is 5. I'm going to get 7. So Alan had 3 of those parts. 7 times 3 is 21. And Carl had 2 of those parts. Each part, 35 divided by 5 is 7. Each part is 7. And Carl had 2, which turns out to be 14. And now compare the two. I'm going to write 14 right in the middle. Sorry. This was 21. And this is supposed to be 14. Now take a look at it. 14 is 2/3 of 21. And when you add them up, you do get 35 stamps. The total number of stamps. Okay. After the exchange, what happened? After the exchange, we're going to use red and underline this. After the exchange, 3/4 of Alan's collection, after the exchange, Carl's collection was 3/4 of Alan's collection. So I'm going to take take 3 and 4, add them up, that's going to give me 7. That simply tells me that if the original collection was divided into 7 equal parts, Carl had 3 of those parts and Alan had 4 of those parts. So I'm going to take my 37 stamps divided by 7. I'm going to get 5. 5 times 4 is going to be 20. 20 will be the number of stamps Alan had after the exchange, and 35 divided by 7 is 5, and 5 times 3 is 15 is the number of stamps that Carl had after the exchange, and the total is still 35, which is not surprising. And now take a look at it. 15 is 3/4 of 20. Okay, now we also know one more thing, that after the exchange, 2/5 of Carl's stamps were Canadian, the rest were American. So out of 15, 2/5 of the stamps are Canadian. 1/5 of 15 is 3. 15 divided by 5, which is 3. 3 times 2 is 6. So 6 must be the total number of Canadian stamps that Carl still has. If out of 15 stamps, 6 of them are Canadian and the rest are American, the number of American stamps will be 15 minus 6, or 9. Okay, if Carl received 9 American stamps and Alan originally had 21 American stamps, from 21, if we subtract 9, we're going to get 12, and Alan must still have 12 American stamps. If he now has 20 stamps and 12 of them are American, 20 minus 12 is 8, so 8 of them must be Canadian. The question asks, what part of Alan's stamps were American? Well, Alan, after the exchange, had only 20 stamps, and 12 of them were American. So we are going to say our answer has to be 12 over 20. And if you simplify the fraction, you're going to get, if you divide both the numerator and the denominator by 4, you're going to get 3 over 5. So the final answer is, after the exchange, 3/5 of Alan's stamps were still American.